Good afternoon, and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host, Ergun Kırlıkovalı, and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at mythsandrealities.com. In episode 50, we have seen how Boghos Nubar Pasha, the head of Armenian National Delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, revealed in a letter to the French government, which was received at the French Foreign Office on December 3, 1918, that, I quote, "The Armenians have been, since the beginning of the war, de facto belligerents, as they have fought alongside the Allies on all fronts, enduring heavy sacrifices and great suffering," unquote. No word about the claim of systematic extermination by the Ottomans. None. Nubar repeated these confessions in a letter to the Times of London, which was published on January 30th, 1919, where he wrote, and I quote, "The Armenians have been belligerents de facto since they indignantly refused to side with Turkey," unquote. He said the Armenians' faithfulness to the Allies ended up causing the Armenians unspeakable suffering and dreadful losses. Again, no word about the claim of systematic extermination by the Ottomans. He had all the chance, but no word about systematic extermination. In Palestine and Syria, Nubar said, where the Armenian volunteers recruited by the Armenian National Delegation at France's request made up more than half of the French contingent and played a large role in the victory of General Allenby. Furthermore, in the Caucasus, he wrote, the 150,000 Armenians in the Imperial Russian Army and more than 50,000 Ottoman-Armenian volunteers contributed to the Ottoman Empire's loss of a great portion of Eastern Anatolia. While Nubar was writing these well-known facts, of course, he was striving for a place at the Paris Peace Conference table, where he was shunned. Little did he know, or seem to care, that these same lines would amount to an irrefutable Armenian confession, historic evidence and proof positive that the Armenian suffering was not due to a systematic extermination campaign by the Ottoman government as fallaciously and persistently claimed, but due to the treasonable acts of most Ottoman Armenians as in siding with the invading enemy armies. Here it is, directly from the horse's mouth. Both letters are readily available on the internet. These two letters of confession by Nubar sum up why the Ottomans, who were fighting for their survival, brutal invasions on 5 fronts, while also combating a widespread Armenian insurgency at home, had to move out of the war zones, the Armenian rebels, and their logistic-base population, so that the latter could not resupply and assist the rebels. It was a wartime military measure taken to mitigate a wartime military threat, purely in defense of the Turkish homeland. Relocation as a strategy in war has appeared in various forms throughout history, but especially so from the mid-18th century onwards, all the way up to the present day. Professor Edward J Erickson makes that point in his book, A Global History of Relocation in Counterinsurgency Warfare, by analyzing a list of such cases. Among the many cases examined were these prominent ones: the removal of the French Acadians of Canada by the British in 1755, expulsion of the Navajo and other eastern tribes from their ancestral homes by the U.S. from 1830 onwards, removal of the Boer by the British in 1900, uprooting of the Cubans by the Spanish in 1895, internment of the Filipinos by the U.S. in 1901, transportation of the Jews of Pale by the Russians in 1915, resettlement of the Armenian insurgents by the Ottomans in 1915, internment of Japanese Americans, non-combatant citizens, by the U.S. in 1942, relocation of Chinese Malays by the British in 1953, and the internment of 1/3 of Algerian population by France in the 1954-1962 war. There are many more cases, of course, of mass relocation in counterinsurgency warfare, but to select the Ottoman relocation of Armenian insurgents out of the lot as if with tweezers, distort the facts surrounding it, and attach the false charge of systematic extermination to it, when Armenian leaders themselves confess publicly that the Armenians were de facto belligerents, can only be explained by a blend of Western prejudice, Orientalism, ethnic discrimination, religious bias, racist propaganda, and Armenian political pressure. Continuing the series on Armenian confessions, today I will explore with you yet another major Armenian confession, that of the first Prime Minister of Armenia, Hovannes Katchznouni. The Manifesto of Hovannes Katchznouni has been published in 1955 by the Armenian Information Service, located at 471 Park Avenue, Suite 7D, New York. It was translated from the original in Armenian by Matthew A. Callender and then edited by John Roy Carlson, who's also Arthur A. Derunian in Armenian. Katchaznouni informs his readers that this is a manifesto which he prepared for the convention of foreign branches of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, or A.R.F for short, aka Dashnags. It convened in Bucharest, Romania, during the month of April 1923. Katchaznouni, convinced that the questions raised in the manifesto will be seriously considered by every Armenian, had it published, complete and without any alterations, to make it public property, except the last 3 or 4 pages, which contain proposals to the party's governing bodies, that's A.R.F's government bodies. He signed it in July 1923. Allow me to share with you some portions from it. It is called the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, in parentheses Dashnak Sutyun, has nothing to do anymore. The Manifesto of Hovannes Katchznouni, first Prime Minister of the independent Armenian Republic. Katchaznouni reassures his listeners that his manifesto had his deliberate and serious consideration. He warns that his final conclusion may cause some general embarrassment, perhaps resentment, in the convention. He then asks them to please believe 2 things. A, that it is more difficult for him to write those words than for participants to listen to them from his own lips. B, that those words are not the result of thoughtless dispositions or hasty resolve. He begs the participants to be patient and have an open mind, something not easy for men who have lived a party life and have thought from a party angle all their lives. Katchaznouni then proceeds First, with some background information on the various phases of the Armenian cause, from the World War I to the Lausanne Conference, and the role played by the A.R.F. during that period. I quote, "At the beginning of the fall of 1914, when Turkey had not yet entered the war, but had already been making preparations, Armenian revolutionary bands began to be formed in Transcaucasia with great enthusiasm and especially with much uproar. Contrary to the decision taken during the general meeting at Erzurum, only a few weeks before, the A.R.F. had active participation in the formation of the bands and their future military action against Turkey. In an undertaking of such gravity, fraught with most serious consequences, individual agents of the Transcaucasian A.R.F. acted against the will of the general meeting of the party in Erzurum. Why?" Unquote. He then urges the audience to recall that the A.R.F. in the past had been a follower rather than an instigator of movements that had originated elsewhere and beyond their control. He gives the examples of 1903 rebellions on the occasion of Russia's seizure of church properties, 1905-1906 bloody encounters between Tatars and Armenians, and 1903-1906 movements of the labor classes, when the A.R.F. was being led at Baku, Tiflis, and Batum by the policies of the foreign socialist parties. He adds, I quote, "It would be useless to argue today whether Armenian bands of volunteers should have entered the field or not. In the fall of 1914, Armenian volunteer bands organized themselves and fought against the Turks because Armenians could not refrain themselves from organizing and fighting. This was an inevitable result of a psychology on which the Armenian people had nourished itself during an entire generation. That mentality should have found its expression and did so." Unquote. He asserts that the A.R.F. would stop the movement even if it wished to do so, could not stop the movement, as it was able to use the existing conditions, give effect to the desires, hopes, and frenzy, organize the ready forces. He contends that the A.R.F. could not go against the current and push forward its own plan because it was unfit, especially unfit for one particular reason. The A.R.F. is a people's mass, strong in instinct, but weak in comprehension. I quote, "If the formation of bands was wrong, the root of that error must be sought much further and more deeply. At the present time, it is important to register only the evidence that we did participate in that volunteer movement to the largest extent, and we did that contrary to the decision and the will of the general meeting of the party. The winter of 1914 and the spring of 1915 were the periods of greatest enthusiasm and hope for all Armenians in the Caucasus, including, of course, the Dashnaksutyun, the A.R.F. We had no doubt that the war would end with complete victory of the Allies, Turkey would be defeated and dismembered, and its Armenian population would at last be liberated." Unquote. Katchaznouni points out that Armenians had embraced Russia wholeheartedly without any compunction, as they believed without justification that the Tsarist government would grant Armenians a self-government in the Caucasus and in the Armenian vilayets liberated from Turkey as a reward for the Armenian loyalty and assistance. Katchaznouni maintains that Armenians had created a dense atmosphere of illusion in their minds and implanted Armenian desires into the minds of others. He affirms that Armenians had lost their sense of reality. I want to carry it away with dreams. I quote, "From mouth to mouth, from ear to ear, passed mysterious words purported to have been spoken in the palace of the viceroy. Attention was called to some kind of a letter by Vorontsov Dashko, who is the viceroy, to the Catholicos as an important document in our hands to use in the presentation of our rights and claims. A cleverly composed letter with very indefinite sentences and generalities, which might be interpreted in any manner according to one's desire. We overestimated the ability of the Armenian people, its political and military power, and the extent and importance of the services of our people rendered to the Russians. And by overestimating our very modest worth and merit, we were naturally exaggerating our hopes and expectations," unquote. Katchaznouni claims the mass exiles and massacres which took place during the summer and autumn of 1915 were mortal blows to the Armenian cause. He adds that half of the historical Armenia, where the foundations of Armenian independence would be laid according to the traditions inherited by European diplomacy, was denuded of Armenians. The Armenian provinces of Turkey were without Armenians. I quote, "The Turks knew what they were doing and have no reason to regret today. It was the most decisive method of eradicating the Armenian question from Turkey. Again, it would be useless to ask today to what extent the participation of volunteers in the war was a contributory cause of the Armenian calamity. No one can claim that the savage persecutions would not have taken place if our behavior on this side of the frontier was different, as no one can claim the contrary either, that the persecutions would have been the same even if we had not shown hostility to the Turks," unquote. Here, Katchaznouni seems to ignore the fact that during the A.R.F. party annual congress in Erzurum from July 19th to August 2nd, 1914, to which the Turkish government sent its own representatives, the Turkish delegates made the following proposal. If the A.R.F. committee could help the Ottoman army to conquer Transcaucasia by provoking a rebellion in Russia, the Ottoman government would grant Armenia autonomy. This offer of autonomy was one step forward from Armenian reform package, which was already established in February 1914. Source: Esat Boras, The Armenians in History and the Armenian Question, Istanbul, 1988, page 842. Therefore, if the Ottoman Armenians did not betray their own government, take up arms against their own fellow citizens, Turks and other Muslims, and join the invading enemy armies, then there would be no need for relocations and massacres. Armenians would enjoy an autonomous rule in the so-called Armenian vilayets and continue to benefit from the rightly earned term of endearment, the loyal nation. By purposefully resorting to armed insurgency and treason, Armenians destroyed their own peace, prosperity, and dreams. not to mention harmony in Anatolia. No country would allow an armed minority to stage open rebellions in its midst. Going back to Manifesto, Katchaznouni's following determination is particularly eye-opening. I quote, "The struggle that began decades ago against the Turkish government brought about the deportation and extermination of the Armenian people in Turkey and the desolation of Turkish Armenia. This was the terrible fact." Unquote. Katchaznouni's conclusion is supported by Louis Nalbandian's book, The Armenian Revolutionary Movement, Los Angeles, 1963, pages 67 through 89, titled Revolutionary Activity in Turkish Armenia, 1860 to 1865. The Zeytun Rebellion of 1862 was the beginning of the extensive uprisings directed against the Ottoman government. After establishing many secret and violent societies like the Union of Salvation, the Black Cross Society, the Protectors of the Fatherland, the Armenian Party, the Hunchaks and the Dashnaks, and many others, and staging hundreds of bloody uprisings, assassinations, raids, bombings, and finally committing the supreme treason by joining the invading enemy armies, Armenians sealed their own fate. Turks only defended their home. Here, I must agree with Katchaznouni. No one in the Armenian leadership of the past 180 years has been courageous enough to accept this simple fact, except Katchaznouni, Armenia's first prime minister. I congratulate him for his honesty. Katchaznouni continues, I quote, "Civilized humanity might very well be shaken with rage in the face of this unspeakable crime. Statesmen might utter menacing words against criminal Turkey. Blue, yellow, orange books and papers might be published condemning Turkey." Unquote. Here, Katchaznouni is referring to officially sanctioned collection of diplomatic documents published by a government to promote the government's position on events. In World War I, all major powers had their own color book, such as the British Blue Book, the French Yellow Book, the German White Book, the Austrian Red Book, the Russian Orange Book, and more. These were crude propaganda tools stereotyping events and individuals and groups, and even entire nations. Imperialist, colonialist, and racist views would be presented in such books as state policies. They would fail to comply with today's standards of rule of law, democracy, human rights, civil rights, and critical thinking. Unfortunately, some Armenian historians today still promote the British Blue propaganda books as reliable source of information, and they're feeding it to the unsuspecting public. Katchaznouni adds, I quote, "Divine punishment against the criminals might be invoked in churches by clergymen of all denominations. The press of all countries might be filled with horrible descriptions and details and the testimony of the eyewitnesses." Unquote. Western media was not much concerned with accuracy. Armenian activists would pass their racist stories defaming Muslims, mostly Turks, to missionaries and diplomats, who then would feed Western press such embellishments. There was no sense of fairness, honesty, or integrity. The New York Times, for example, published 145 anti-Turkish stories in 1915 alone, And you know how many chances they gave to Turks to rebut them? You guessed it, 0. This example alone gives a truth seeker a good idea about the journalistic standards of World War I era. Going back to Katchaznouni, I quote, "Let them say this or that, but the work was already done, and words would not revive the corpses fallen in the Arabian deserts, rebuild their ruined hearths, repopulate the country, now become desolate. The Turks knew what they ought to do, and they did it." Unquote. Yes, Turks knew what they had to do. They had to defend their home. They had to fight against the treacherous rebellions, dastardly treason, and brutal foreign invasions to save the country. Turks were ready to die for their country, and they did just that. More than 3 million Muslims, mostly Turks, died in too many fronts. 1.2 million of them in Eastern Anatolia alone, and 518,000 of those at the hands of Armenian revolutionaries. But you cannot find this information in the color books or the columns of the New York Times. Katchaznouni's manifesto is very important as it places accurately the entire blame of Ottoman-Armenians' demise squarely on the Armenian leaders. His courageous and insightful manifesto warrants a line-by-line analysis, and we will do just that. Thank you for joining me. See you next week.